activities. An NYPD spokesperson pointed out that utilization of plainclothes officers during demonstrations does not necessarily imply undercover or intelligence functions. During last year's protest, where there were instances of criminal activity, making the use of plainclothes officers was appropriate. The MTA police said they accommodate peaceful protests and that they take all appropriate police measures to ensure the safety and security of our customers, but we do not discuss the particulars of those operations. The Intercept reports that according to documents, the MTA Counterterrorism Division and intelligence officers have been monitoring individual activists on social networks and at live events. The report comes a week after the Department of Homeland Security documents obtained through the Freedom of Information Act revealed agents were monitoring the Twitter account of DeRay McKesson. McKesson is a Black Lives Matter activist who an official described as a, quote, professional protester known to law enforcement. McKesson said he was not surprised.
I'm sure I'm not the only person in the movement for whom that is true. You know, the status quo didn't become as such by happenstance. People work to make the conditions like this, and there are a lot of people who will do whatever it takes to keep things from changing. And law enforcement in the history of civil rights work has always been key to tampering any sort of social change.
The revelation raises concerns about criminalizing the exercise of free speech and the right to protest. Some activists say they think they're being monitored as threats. Joining me now is George Joseph, reporter for The Intercept, and Keegan Steffen, an organizer with People's Monday, the group that plans the actions in Grand Central which were being surveilled. Mr. Joseph, let me begin with you. What was previously known about law enforcement surveillance of Black Lives Matter activists before your rather detailed report revealed some of these goings-on?
Yeah, so what we knew about law enforcement surveillance of Black Lives Matter, both on a national level and a local level, was mostly confined to social media monitoring. So a few weeks ago, I wrote a story in The Intercept that through some Freedom of Information Act documents proved that the Department of Homeland Security, our supposed counter-terror federal agency, was actually monitoring Black Lives Matter protests on Twitter, using Facebook data, that sort of thing, to figure out where people were moving all across the country since Ferguson. But when we got these documents from Keegan and some other activists, actually, we weren't expecting that it was going to be anything more than that sort of social media monitoring. So for them to actually admit in the documents that they had undercover police officers attending protests regularly was pretty surprising.
Right. So Keegan, MTA documents use photos from your social media accounts. Did you have any insight about this, any indication that officers could be monitoring your posts?
It's not necessarily a surprise that they're monitoring my Twitter posts. You know, those are obviously public and can somewhat reasonably be viewed by anybody. But it's surprising that someone from NYPD Intelligence was forwarding them on to other police enforcement agencies with the purported intent of preventing terrorism. Because, you know, what I'm doing is documenting activity that basically citizens should be engaged in and the government should be protecting, not labeling as terrorism and treating as such.
Given that analysis, why are government officials, law enforcement in particular, monitoring the accounts of these activists and groups? What is the point of it? What is the purported intention of it as well?
I think one of the great insights I got while doing the report was I spoke to this former law enforcement officer who actually himself was surveilled in the documents we saw. His name is Ray Lewis. He was a former Philadelphia police officer. And he told me from his experience in stopping protests, they often want to identify key figures, and we see this in the documents, people who they view as leaders, people who they maybe view as documenters, and seek to target them. The point being, in order to disrupt protests, to weaken them, and to sort of potentially stop movements that may push to hold police more accountable for their violence.
So explicitly, the point is to counteract those aggressive features of the movement by, you know, people who are behaving legally, but to disrupt them because they're being critical of the police.
And not even necessarily aggressive. And a lot of the documents, they refer to these protests as orderly, peaceful, oh, they're just doing the regular routine. And yet they're trying to stop any sort of action.
By what measures? What would they do, for instance? How could they stop what was going on with the activists?
Well, one of the stories that was most striking was that a lot of the activists who felt very intense monitoring later argued to me specifically that they felt that the intelligence that had been gathered on them helped lead to eventual police targeting. So you saw this with the beating of a person named Elsa Waith, who in my story had been surveilled for weeks before, and then at this April 14th protest, she was brutally assaulted just for trying to film the police. Similar things have happened to Jose LaSalle, one of the key figures in the documents who is frequently mentioned and has photos shared of him. He was also recently arrested, probably for similar reasons.
Wow. So Keegan, have you ever been directly confronted by law enforcement officials about protest activities, and how does this make you feel when you hear the kind of targeting of activists with the intent to disrupt, even in terms of even if the consequences happen to be, as they were with the young lady, a violent one?
Definitely seeing proof that the NYPD is monitoring my activity with the purported intent of preventing terrorism has a chilling effect on me going out to protests and expressing my First Amendment rights, because I know things that have happened to people that have been targeted for terrorism by our government, even when they haven't been proven to be involved in anything or even charged with anything. Really devastating things can happen to people, so that's intimidating, and it was very concerning to learn that I'm being monitored that closely. I've also had individual officers approach me in public and use my name when they have no reason to know my name other than potential monitoring.
So what do you think law enforcement seeks to achieve through monitoring Black Lives Matter activists? What is their point?
It's unclear. It very much feels like they're trying to disrupt it and disorganize it and get us to stop demonstrating. One of the more surprising things in the documents was that the MTA admitted that they were using incessant amplification over the top of our protest to stop us from what we were doing, to drown out the things that we were saying, and all we were doing was reading the facts aloud of people who were killed by police officers. So that seemed like a pretty direct infringement on our First Amendment rights to free speech.
All right, George Joseph and Keegan Stephan, thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Still ahead, after presidential hopeful Marco Rubio accidentally hit a 4-year-old in the face with a football, the 4-year-old wants, he says, a rematch. The details next.
Shopping online is as easy as it gets.